All right. The Lord be with you this afternoon.
Is it over?
Yeah, the response isn't also with you. Just wanting to make sure we're all awake. If you're wondering where in the world Markdale is, if you've ever eaten Chapman's ice cream, it's right beside Markdale Baptist Church. Going to be speaking on Ontario Baptist Confessionalism. This is a subject that I've been interested in for many years. We all have hobbies. One of my hobbies is reading old Baptist confessions. Mark's nodding his head, so he's in the right room. And I read a lot on this subject when I did a two-part article series for the Baptist Quarterly in the UK on the downgrade controversy. And this is my foray. So this paper will blossom through my own research and interviewing denominational leaders and different historians with their fingers in the different veins of Baptist life in Ontario and in Canada, and will eventually become a Canadian Baptist Historical Society chapter in the volume on Ontario Baptists. But this is just a foray. This will be a whistle-stop tour, a high-level overview for those who might not be familiar with this subject. Spurgeon, who was famously appreciated on both sides of the Atlantic, including in the Baptist press here in this province, once said this: "Every man who believes anything must have a creed, whether he writes it down and print it or no." So confessionalism may simply be defined as a formal statement of what the Bible teaches about faith, practice, and morality, and while never possessing creedal authority, have been binding and normative in Free Will Baptist associations, not meaning Free Will Baptist, but Free Will Baptist associations. Traditionally, like wider Christianity and the ecumenical creeds, Baptists have been confessional, whether that be the 1689 Baptist Confession for particular Baptists, or something like the Orthodox Creed for the General Baptists, and to a lesser extent, the General Baptists, who are the Sixth Principle Baptists. You're getting quite minimalistic on that end of things. But confessions at a denominational level, along with congregational variants, summarized what they believed the Bible taught, gave cohesion to congregational life, a basis for discipline, and a foundation for wider associational and Christian activity, not to mention apologetics and polemics and other things such as that. Such Baptist confessionalism was representative of wider Protestant scholasticism or orthodoxy from about 1640 up until the 1830s, the culmination of codification of Reformation beliefs and practices. However, beginning in the 1830s, we see a process of deconfessionalization, influenced first by Romanticism that prioritized piety over doctrine, and then later in the century through modernist impulses and influences. And since that time and the great modernist fundamentalist debates we've heard a little bit about today, there have been a variety of different responses in terms of confessionalism. Some Baptists claiming no authority but the Bible, individual soul liberty, and other things that we've also heard today, while others still continue to see the usefulness of confessions, either formally or informally, and of late, and we're going to talk about this at the end, we've even seen a renewed interest with different cultural pressures in what I call reconfessionalism, or reconfessionalization. An invaluable reference for the subject, in case you don't know, and I brought the old one, but I forgot the newer one at home, is Lumpkin's volume, which you've probably seen, and there's also an updated version, 2011, by Bill J. Leonard. And in both editions, Ontario only makes the briefest of appearances amidst other British and American and international Baptist confessions. However, we as Ontario Baptists have a very long confessional heritage with great variety, and great variety also in terms of the contributions of the Baptists that have aided that. And so our own unique treatment and handling is certainly called for, and this paper again is sketching that. And so we would do well to do this. Uniquely Ontario project. Ontario has always been the most populous province. rivaling with the Maritime provinces, the highest number of Baptists. I think today we could probably say it has the highest number of Baptists, impacting international missions, Canadian missions. And so to understand Ontario Baptist confessionalism is important for understanding Canadian Baptists as a whole. While initially comprised of British or American settlers, Ontario Baptists soon developed a contextual confessional heritage of their own. But that, however, did not mean there was not diversity within the tradition. So our survey here won't get into all of these, but these are some of the diversities. We have diversity of study geographically. We have diversity as well theologically, general, particular, later on liberal, conservative, and so forth. There's also great diversity ethnoculturally as well, with Black Baptists and later Estonian Baptists and Chinese Baptists, and eventually this paper will encapsulate those traditions and confessions as well. Also denominationally today, there is the convention, the fellowship, the National Baptist Convention, the General Baptist Conference, smaller groups like the Sovereign Grace Fellowship, and many independent Baptist churches. And so there's great diversity in the number of different types of Baptists, and that is reflected in their confessionalism, and we'll explore some of those here. The main primary sources will be denominational, associational, congregational, and educational confessions. And then secondarily, primary sources are going to be ordination statements, church covenants, denominational policies, and personal documents where possible. So the first section is the early 19th century. So from 1796, the first Baptist church in Ontario, up to 1879 on the cusp of the formation of Toronto Baptist College. So the earliest Upper Canadian Baptists, that's Ontario, like their British North American, that's Canadian counterparts, came from either British or American streams of Baptist thought and brought with them their respective confessions. And this was in the period of Baptist orthodoxy when, regardless of your theology, you wrote it down. You had a confession that you adhered to. And highly prizing, regardless of your group, prizing church order, they usually, without exception, adopted a confession and a church covenant when the church was actually formed. The majority of early Baptists across Canada, and also in Ontario, embraced the Second London Baptist Confession, or in time the New Hampshire Baptist Confession, and the Free Will Baptists, who were always smaller, embraced the Free Will document from the United States, I believe. In time, as I mentioned, the New Hampshire Confession and Covenant became popular, but also Canadian Baptists Ontario Baptists began to produce their own native confessions of faith. And so among the many hundreds of churches that would arise, we can't pay attention to all of them, nor the associations, but we'll look at a few of them. And Iveson and Rosser, which is another, and sadly all of the free versions are gone. There were a whole bunch of copies of this book, and it was mentioned in one of the earlier lectures. They're all gone now, so you'll have to pay, however, on eBay or wherever you can find it, but you missed your chance. They state that, again, the covenant and the statement of faith were 2 of 5 prerequisites for establishing a Baptist church in this time period. So Baptists placed great stress upon their polity. The First Baptist Association and ordination occurred in eastern Ontario along the St. Lawrence River. 1794, Hallowell or Westlake Baptist Church was formed. Also, the first ordination took place there, 1799, Reuben Crandall. And the first association was formed there in 1802. So that's a lot of firsts within a very short span of time. And in Iveson and Rosser, I have yet to go into the original sources in great detail, but just from their excerpts, the minutes that are recorded there, there's a great emphasis placed upon these things that we've heard, confessions and covenants and such. And also their connection with the Massachusetts Baptist Missionary Society, who stressed such matters of polity, ensured that that was the case. Later leaders in the East, as we've already heard about, John Gilmour and the Ottawa Valley Association, Canada College, Montreal, were open communion, but in Western Ontario, they were closed communion. Yet it was in the western half of the province where Baptists were greatly concentrated. So the area where Mark's from, kind of west of Hamilton here, that was a real Baptist stronghold in the 1800s. And a couple examples will suffice here. The first is from the North Shore of Lake Erie, Bayham Baptist Church. I'm in the possession of the church covenant and such there, and they were founded in 1819. And a council was held to establish it, its members, its officers. In that exact same meeting, 11 articles of faith, 11 articles of practice, and a church covenant were drawn up. And of particular note, the fifth article of practice said, "We believe that every church has a right to discipline her own members." And if one changed their view on faith and practice, broke the covenant, I think that was to Gord's point that we were talking about later. What do you do with churches with this notion of soul liberty? I think that because of the covenant that they entered into, that plays into that conversation. They needed to be sent out of the church if they could not be reclaimed for the sake of harmony. So very important. A most unique expression of confessionalism and theology is that of the, wait for it, you may never have heard of them before, the particular Covenanted Baptist Church of Canada. Never heard of them before. They existed in Elgin County, Middlesex County, maybe a little bit into Kent and Lambton counties. But they originally, Scottish Baptists, or Scotch Baptists, we should say. And originally they had fellowship with other regular Baptist churches. They even went to one of the associations together in what's now Ingersoll, the Cami plant. But eventually they distanced themselves because they believed that the regular Baptists were too soft in their views of predestination. Also because regular Baptists use musical instruments and did not baptize in streams of living water. So this would be a group amongst the primitive Baptists. And there are some very interesting things in there, kind of against pluralism and against the mission movement about preaching. There's actually an article in their statement of faith on preaching, which is very interesting. Beginning in 1844, the Grand River Association was formed, comprising of churches from Norfolk, Oxford, you need to know your Ontario geography, Oxford, Brant, Wentworth, Haldimand, a little bit Elgin counties, and it's a classic example of a regular Baptist statement of faith being both Calvinistic and closed communion. And not only did these regions represent a Baptist stronghold, but as mission work moved further north in southern Ontario, one missionary, a colporteur, Alexander Stewart, went from Delhi north and planted some 15 churches in the region where I presently live in Midwestern Ontario. And so we can see that this statement of faith was transported as well, and so had geographic distribution. And very importantly, in this confession, it was actually Brother Mark that first tipped me off to this, I think probably a decade or more ago. It says this: "We believe it to be highly necessary for our peace and prosperity and for the honor of God to be careful in keeping a strict gospel discipline among us, and not receive any member but such as make a good confession of repentance toward God and faith toward our Lord Jesus Christ," which would also involve agreeing to the articles that they hold to, and also to cut off, reject, or put away any member of our communion, fellowship, watch, and care. And so that's not just thinking at a congregational level, that's thinking at an association level. And so while you did have liberty of conscience, and we can't force you to believe, and the state can't force you to believe, if you're going to covenant and be part of our association, then you have responsibility to us under this, and we can set you outside of this. You're free to believe what you want outside, but you'll be outside of this particular fellowship. Also, slower to start, the Baptists of York, Market Lane, March Street, Bond Street, Jarvis Street, we've already heard them today. Also a significant confession of faith to study and investigate. It's not necessarily long, but it's substantive and Calvinistic. and that Fife and McMaster were both members of this church, and the connection with the university and flagship of the denomination, very important to study, and I'm going to do that in a bit greater detail. But from 1880 to 1925, the dawn of the 20th century, this period represents a hinge. A hinge where it begins confessional, and for many Baptists, but not all, it ends in a non-confessional vein. As an expression of unity, Ontario Baptists finally realized a theological enterprise at the Woodstock Literary Institute. And in 1880, portions of that were transferred to Canada Baptist College in Toronto, particularly for the seminary students. And Senator McMaster, a member of Jarvis Street, influenced the trust deed. And in the trust deed, we see that leading Baptists were clearly committed to a regular Baptist, a Calvinistic church polity, being a believer who had been baptized to be involved in a number of ways. And so this then is a very formative document at kind of a provincial level, this document from what would become McMaster University. However, 8 years later, in 1888, when the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec was formed out of the associations, out of the missionary societies, it did not have a doctrinal standard. And the reason was because there were differing views on communion, but also because every association already had their own statements, and so it was felt unnecessary at that time. So while having no doctrinal basis, the convention at its educational session of October 1925 did produce a quote-unquote confession. I put it in quotation marks because it wasn't a binding confession. And it was a near verbatim statement of that 1880 Toronto Baptist College trust deed. But unlike that document, this was never binding. Its purpose was to demonstrate, in the midst of the McMaster controversy that we heard about earlier, it was to demonstrate that Ontario Baptists, Convention Baptists, which was the only type at the time, remained true to essential Christianity and historic Baptist views. It spoke of those maintaining substantially the following doctrines. It was somewhat vague on certain subjects, but on the other hand showed continuity with the past, and yet it allowed for partial subscription or no subscription at all, personal understanding, or even disregard, because again, it was not binding. And so it might rather be described as a snapshot rather than a confession. This is what we believe at this moment, but not all of us necessarily. It's what most of us believe. It's a snapshot. And so the convention had been confessional in its ethos, educationally, associationally, congregationally, etc. However, this marks a hinge that the convention was becoming non-confessional in many respects, although there are certainly exceptions. Into the 20th century, 1925 to 2005, I recognize that's a rather long period of time, but the Union of Regular Baptist Churches. So coming out of the split that Dr. Bebbington referred to this morning, the Union of Regular Baptist Churches and Toronto Baptist Seminary, Toronto Baptist Seminary still holds this as its doctrinal standard, adopted the statement of the Bible Baptist Union. And while there were representatives in Canada in 5 provinces, it was a largely American union. However, as the head of it, T.T. Shields, not only hosting the first convention in Toronto, he was the primary author of this document. So it's interesting that in the early Baptists, right, American Baptists influence our confessionalism, and now here you have a Canadian who's influencing American Baptist confessionalism. Very, very interesting. And though the statement is not comprehensive, it is detailed, and it's seen as a corrective to certain points that were under assault at this particular time. Fast forward 2 minutes. Okay, so we're going to skip over a few people. Let's talk about the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches. When they came together, they used the New Hampshire Confession as their doctrinal standard, and yet kept it sufficiently vague on a number of points. But in terms of adhering to it, every church was supposed to, but it was left to the different regions to enforce that unless you were a staff member or a missionary. What about the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec? Well, again, this non-confessionalism continued, and a number of authors spoke about and historiographically seeking to recast Baptist history, that Baptists have never been confessional, right? To justify their position of not being confessional. However, one important step that came close to becoming a confession was this, we believe, first published in 1985, but again, it was ensured that it would be a resource document rather than a binding document. During this time, interestingly, we have the gathering of Baptists that arises between 1993 and 1995. I'll end it just with them. They were concerned about the literalistic direction of McMaster University and the centralization of the denomination. And so they were anti-confessional in some respects, and yet ironically also have their own statement of affirmation and covenant statement. So sadly, for want of time, I can't get into the last 15 years or so. But the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec have had great struggles, particularly surrounding matters of gender and sexuality. And the Fellowship Baptists are in the midst of a 3-year process in which they are reviewing their statement of faith. And so again, showing that one group is non-confessional and many other groups are confessional. And so it's very interesting that as we face these modern issues, we're actually coming back as Ontario Baptists to our beginnings again. And the largest of all the Ontario Baptist denominations would be confessional, namely the Fellowship, Canadian National Baptist Convention, and the General Baptist Conference. Thank you.